Hello gang, Tattooed Biker here with you, and welcome back to the Unexplained. Tonight, prepare to be captivated as we dive into the mysterious world of Bigfoot sightings and encounter stories, all submitted by real viewers just like you. From the depths of Maine, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Arkansas, from unexplained sightings to eerie encounters in the dead of night, these stories will have you looking over your shoulder every time you walk out into the woods. So grab your gear, and let's ride to Bigfoot country.
Number 1. Dear TB, I'm 38 and an Army veteran, trying to work as a local carpenter here in Maine, the state where I've lived most of my life. I've had 2 encounters with the creature that I'll soon tell you about. One that occurred when I was a teenager, and actually one a few years ago. The house that I'm currently living in is my father's, since he now has multiple heart conditions and would have to live alone. Me and my sister both grew up in this house, which is here in eastern Maine. Living here as a child always felt a little, off, as if something just wasn't the right way. It's hard to describe, really. The house is surrounded by woods on almost all sides and sits on a dead-end road with 6 or 7 houses down the way. We own 70 acres of dense forest that is littered with ATV trails and walking trails. I've been out on these trails over 100 times, probably just clearing them for neighbors who we let use them and trying to maintain them. But every time I'm out there, I feel like I'm being stalked. In this area, I nor my father have ever seen a bear, a wolf, or mountain lion. Nothing really above the size of a bobcat. As a teen, I liked dressing up in military gear and going out to play war and similar games. I'd normally go out with my friends Sid and Marvin, 2 guys who lived down the road. Sid was an older dude, around 18, who smoked and did the average tough guy stuff. Marv, who I'm still friends with, even today, we even served together until he was discharged. He was pretty much more on my level. We were both pretty timid young guys who didn't really associate with most people and just enjoyed being out in the woods and chilling. Anyway, one day we'd gone out around 3 p.m. on a chilly winter evening to go play as we did on most days. We grabbed our gear, which was stuff that Sid's dad, who was a Vietnam vet, had given him, and then Sid had shared with us. This even included medical kits, an ammo box, grenade pouches, etc. He even gave Sid an old handgun. Without the magazine or ammunition, of course, but Sid's dad still didn't allow him to take it out of the house, so after a while of walking down one of the paths, we come to one of our favorite spots, which is sort of like a clearing full of boulders and moss. At the time, it was covered in knee-deep snow. Now, normally, my mom wouldn't have let us go out this far, but she wasn't there to say no, since she was in New Hampshire for the holidays. We'd been out there for quite a while, throwing snowballs and pretending they were grenades and blasting at each other with our sticks. It was about 5 p.m. when we were starting to gather our stuff because it was starting to get dark. As I'm scooping up my stuff, Marv talks in a confused and worried tone. "Hey guys, what the hell is that thing?" He takes our attention to a tall, completely black creature standing on 2 legs, its arms dangling by its sides, almost dragging into the snow. From our angle at 50 or 60 yards away, we couldn't see its face, but it was walking away from us. I remember a weird tightness in my chest after realizing that I had no idea what we were looking at. And then Sid suddenly yelled out, "Hey, hairball." Then the creature stopped. My chest grew even tighter, and it felt like my body was frozen after I saw it stop abruptly. It slowly turns towards us. Its face had no real facial features, but It looked to be plain flesh. No nose, eyes, or mouth. We were so frightened that none of us could talk, and it stared at us for a couple minutes before one of us suggested the bright idea of leaving. We crept away as the sun was now getting really low, while one of us was constantly looking back until we got out of sight. Then we bolted back to my house, where we hid inside, collapsing onto the living room floor. We were silent for a moment before I broke out laughing. The others soon joined in, but after a few seconds, Sid said, "Okay, guys, but what did we just see?" We all tried rationalizing, but I think we all knew that we had seen something that just didn't belong. The guys ended up staying the night at my place that night. We stayed up late drinking hot chocolate and every now and then stepping out onto the porch to see if it may have followed us. After a few days, the creature mostly disappeared from our minds. We still got together and hung out, having adventures in the woods. I never told my parents about this thing, because they probably wouldn't have believed me, and I didn't want to go through all the trouble of explaining it to them over and over. I didn't tell my sister either, because she just wouldn't care, and I wouldn't receive any feedback, so it was pointless. We three also never really brought the creature up again. It was kind of like an unspoken agreement. My second encounter transpired in roughly the same area, just about a mile or two from there about 3 years ago. I had just been honorably discharged and had been home with my father for no more than a month, just picking up odd jobs mostly, in auto and house repairs, both being skills that I'd learned from my time overseas. It was a summer evening when I decided to head out to the trails and take a look around. After all, I hadn't been out there for ages and expected the trails to be overgrown. So I took with me some basic brush clearings equipment, such as a hatchet, an old machete, and some other stuff, then set out. Sid had recently moved to Vermont, and Marv had been medically discharged a while ago and left with a leg disability, making it hard to walk. I would have asked him to join me, if not for that. I had made it about a half mile into the main path, moving and cutting up the suspected limbs, branches, and overgrown grass as best as possible, hoping to come back tomorrow with a weed whacker to do some more work. As I got deeper, that feeling of being watched returned. The same feeling I got as a teenager when I was out there. And I started noticing that the dense growth was getting thinner, and more limbs were smashed or pushed out of the way. As well, the tall grass and overgrowth were no longer in the way. In fact, the trail became almost cleared and looked like it was used almost daily. I was shocked that someone cared enough to come out here and clear all this, but as I thought on it more, I remembered that the entrance hadn't been groomed, so how were they getting in? I began looking closely at the ground, noticing feet or paw prints that I had never seen before. I crouched down to gain a better look. The print had 3 pointy toes each, about 6 inches long, and were spaced about 3 feet apart, in sets of 2. I didn't recognize these and decided to follow them just a little further to check it out. About a quarter of a mile later, I see this creature, my second encounter, and so far my last. It was walking from the side of the path at a slow pace, not even acknowledging my presence, at least not yet. It slowly crossed the path and continued into the woods, and after a minute, I walked up to the area where he had entered, and there was a strolling or creeping into the woods, still not noticing me. I could actually hear his arms dragging across the forest floor, and his fur coat still looked silky black, yet I wanted to see its face again, but not to the point where I would risk being spotted. So I slowly reached for my phone, only to realize that it was in the front pocket of my backpack, as I didn't want to lose it while working. I pulled the bag from my shoulders and placed it in front of me, and began unzipping the pocket, but as I did, the creature stopped, just as he had done the last time. Oh, Lord Jesus, I thought, as I froze and my chest tightened. It began to turn. Its fleshy face began staring back at me. I tightened the grip on the hatchet that I had, and now I think about it, that probably wouldn't have done much to this 8-foot behemoth. We both stared motionless for what felt like hours. In reality, I had no idea how long we'd been there. I eventually stood up with my legs feeling numb. I backed away until it was out of sight and then took off just as fast as I could go. As I was running, I was sure I heard a violent scream from behind me, but there was no way I was going to turn and look. Long story short, I haven't been back in those woods for 3 years, and I don't plan on it either. I know this might sound over-exaggerated or fake, like something from a children's book, but I know what I saw, and Marvin knows what he saw. I will never forget this. Signed, Seb. Number 2. Dear Biker, I just listened to one of your Bigfoot videos on YouTube. And back in 1989, my cousin was on a camping trip with his wife. It wasn't a busy day for camping, and according to him, the camping area manager told them that they were the only ones that would be camping there that night. It was a secluded area in Central County, Pennsylvania. Anyways, so it's getting late, and my cousin said he spots something across the lake. He thought it was a bear standing, so he grabbed his binoculars. It was sort of like a bear, but it was standing up on its hind legs. He said, though, that he was sure that it wasn't a bear because it had a face like a 70-year-old man, and the fur was longer than a bear. He thought maybe it was someone in a suit, and it disappeared right then very quickly, whatever it was. He was completely spooked and wanted to leave the park. His wife just thought he was being ridiculous, though, and just having an overactive imagination. She had brought a shotgun and insisted that they'd be fine if anything happened. Anyway, so that night everything is going okay until my cousin is awakened by footsteps. His wife is still asleep, but he doesn't want to wake her. He just tries to be as still as possible. The figure approaches the tent, and my cousin said he was positioned so that his head was on the corner of the tent. This figure then leans down and gently presses its hands around the corner, so the figure is basically putting its hands around my cousin's head. And I don't remember how long he said this lasted, but the thing eventually left. My cousin said that it smelled like mechanical things, like someone who'd been working on a car, although he heard no car. The next morning, everything at the campsite was untouched, no problems at all. My cousin never mentioned anything about finding footprints. There wasn't any evidence that someone had ever been there. He eventually went and researched the area and discovered that their camping spot is supposedly a hot spot for Bigfoot. He firmly believes that what he saw was some type of Sasquatch. Now, I'm not sure if I believe him. If anything, I always thought it was just a person messing with him. I swear I'm just telling you the story my cousin told me. I'm not making anything up. Signed, Darren. Number 3. Dear Biker, I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, in a completely rural Tennessee Valley community. My house was surrounded by forest and mountains. When I was about 14, my dad started to hear strange sounds coming from the hills behind our house. Knocking sounds, as if something was hitting a tree, and the occasional inhuman yell. My dog, a rough and tough outside boy, was very drawn to those hills at random times. His ears would shoot up, and he'd quickly run up to the forest and stay for a while. Him going up into the hills wasn't uncommon, but at the time he started acting particularly suspicious about them. And don't worry, nothing bad happens to him in this story. Anyways, the noises started to become more frequent. My brother and his friend used to hunt for ginseng up in those hills, and they had heard the noises too. Much louder, of course, because they were near the source. One day, the noises just wouldn't stop. They progressed louder and louder, and there was a lot of growling. My brother was pretty much sick of it by now and wanted to know what was up there. It was evening time, about to get dark, so he takes a flashlight and a shotgun and heads up into those hills. He sees a creature that looks what he said could be a Sasquatch. It was tall with broad shoulders, much wider than its torso. He saw its silhouette because of the darkness. He chased it off, came back to the house and told me what happened, and then he drew a sketch of what it looked like. The noises had stopped after that day and they never came back. And a few weeks later, a new Bigfoot special came on the TV. A witness made a sketch of an alleged Bigfoot that looked almost identical to the one that my brother made. To this day, we're still convinced that a Bigfoot lived there. Signed, Vicky. Number 4. Hey TB, back in the early 1990s when I was around 13, I used to stay at my grandfather's house a lot. They lived in a very rural area in southeast Arkansas. Now when I say rural, I mean it was a series of networked dirt roads to get out to their house. The closest neighbors, besides my aunt and uncle, who lived about a quarter of a mile up the road, was over a mile and a half away. This was very backwoods and isolated. Even the closest town was a 12-mile trip. It's in the middle of farmland and mostly woods. They had lived in this house since my mother was a child and had both grown up just a ways down the road. Anyways, there was a general store about 3 or 4 miles down the network of dirt roads. Now this was your typical country general store, run by an old lady and her husband, and its only customers really only consisted of the people who lived out there. One day, my grandmother asked me if I wanted to walk to the general store and get her some milk, eggs, and a few other items, and I told her that I would. She gave me some money and I headed on my way. It was fairly early in the day and I had plenty of time to get back before dark, which I always made sure to do when I was out roaming. Things can get mighty creepy out in the backwoods of Arkansas after nightfall. It's a darkness unlike most people who have lived primarily in cities or towns have ever experienced. I stopped at the bottom of a hill next to this small wooden bridge that you have to cross and messed around at the creek catching crawdads and such. And I just kind of messed around the whole way to the store. By the time I left the store, I realized that it was quickly approaching dark. This was fall and darkness, set on the land pretty early in the day. I didn't want to be walking those lonely, secluded roads and through the woods alone in the dark, so I hurried along just as fast as I could, running and sprinting as much as possible, but it wasn't enough. By the time I'd made it back to the bottom of the hill near the bridge, it was almost completely dark, and there was an eerie sort of glow brought on by the very early night moon that was rising. At the top of the hill, the road was completely straight and flat, with woods on the left and a large cornfield on the right. About half a mile up from the top of the hill is my grandparents' house, and you can see it from there. At the top of the hill, I could see a faint glow of the lights of their house, and I felt a sense of relief because I was kind of freaking out a little bit. But knowing that I was so close and could see the house offered me a little comfort. The field on the right was kind of illuminated by the glow of the moon, and my eyes had adjusted to the darkness pretty well at this point. As I walked up the road, I heard something from over on my left and behind me, on the wooded side of the road. It sounded like leaves being rustled. I turned to look and saw nothing at all at first, but then as my eyes began to adjust, I saw something in the ditch. A black shadowy shape that was slowly moving towards me. At first, I thought it was a dog, but then I realized it was way too big to be a dog. And then I realized that it wasn't actually walking on 4 legs, but crawling like a person would. I stared for a moment, out of sheer confusion, trying to figure out what I was seeing, and then a jolt of fear shot through me as it dawned on me that whatever this strange thing was, it had been trying to sneak up on me. At that exact moment, this thing stood upright out of the ditch on 2 legs. It had the shape of a human with long arms and legs, and was proportioned as such. It stood about 8 feet in height and was completely covered in black or maybe dark brown hair. Its face was dark in color, and I can't recall seeing much in the way of features. It wasn't a bear for certain, or any other kind of animal that I'd ever seen for that matter. I immediately dropped the bag of stuff that I'd been carrying and bolted as fast as my legs could take me towards my grandparents' house. I heard a heavy breathing and growling kind of sound behind me, and I even heard this thing's footsteps running on the gravel as it gave chase. I didn't turn around and was certain that it could grab me at any moment. I then heard it crash off into the woods, letting out an earth-shattering and ungodly scream unlike anything that I've ever heard before or since. Now, I'm positive this thing could have easily caught me had it wanted to, but for some reason it let me go. By the time I reached my grandparents, my heart felt as if it could explode from the combination of adrenaline and being scared beyond any type of fear that I'd ever felt before or since, and the full-on sprinting as hard and fast as possible for about a half-straight mile. I flew into the house and, in an incoherent mess of hyperactive gibberish, tried to explain to my grandparents what had just happened. My grandmother didn't really seem to believe me, but did believe that something had scared me and acted pretty weird about the whole thing. She tried to convince me that it was just a dog or some other animal. The next morning, I woke up and found my grandpa sitting outside whittling wood underneath the shade tree in the front yard, as he liked to do. I went and sat down beside him in one of the old metal lawn chairs. Now, he was a very rational man, down to earth, and had grown up and had hunted in that area his entire life. He knew every square inch of it, mapped in his mind. He knew every type of critter and creature that lived in those woods, what noise they made, where to find them, how to catch them, etc. Now, I had only been hunting with him for a couple of years, but had been going out into those woods with him since a pretty young age. He had passed a lot of his knowledge down to me during those adventures. I spoke to him about what had happened to me the night before and told him what I knew, what I saw. It wasn't my overactive imagination, and I wasn't making it up, and it definitely wasn't a dog. He knew that I wasn't just some dumb 13-year-old kid, and he knew that I knew things that he had taught me. He stopped whittling, looked me right in the eyes, and said, "I know what you saw. I've seen it before too. There's things out in those woods that people don't understand, and a person ought not go fooling around with." I remember those words clearly to this day because they gave me some affirmation. But at the same time, it made me realize that whatever I'd seen was very real in existence and beyond my understanding. My grandpa then went on to tell me that far back in the woods there are some cliffs, and at the bottom of those cliffs is a cave. He told me that the cave was where the creature lived. He had once stumbled upon it a long time ago while he was hunting. He said he was standing on top of the cliff, looking at it, when a creature fitting that same description emerged and started screaming wildly at him and throwing rocks. He said he took a shot at it, missed it, and then this thing gave chase. But my grandpa was on top of the cliff, so to get to him, this thing had to go around a pretty good distance and then up, which he said that it quickly began to do, so he hightailed it out of there in a hurry. He said the whole way back home that he felt like he was being watched and kept hearing twigs snap behind him, and he was certain that it was following him, stalking him even. He made it home, and as he reached his front porch, he turned and looked back at the woods from where he'd come, and he saw it peeking out at him from behind a tree. Later that night, he said that he and my grandmother awoke in the early morning hours to large rocks being thrown at the house and ungodly howling noises from outside, and this thing was actually trying to get into the house. He said he could hear it walking around the front porch and rattling the doorknobs, banging on windows, and it sounded like it was muttering to itself in a low and deep garbled voice, but it didn't really sound like any kind of language, just random gibberish. After a while, the thing went back to throwing rocks and howling, so my grandpa grabbed his shotgun and fired it out the front door a few times, into the darkness, in the direction of the howling, and said he heard it run back into the woods. Now, he didn't know if he'd hit it or not. He said, though, that that was the last time that he'd ever seen or heard from it. But over the years, an occasional farmer's cow would be mutilated, or somebody's hunting dog would go missing, or someone would have a story about some strange creature they had seen. He also said it scared my grandmother beyond words, and she absolutely has refused to ever talk about it, or even acknowledge that it ever happened, which explains her acting weird about it when I told her what happened to me. Now, I know it's a pretty far-fetched story, and you can believe me or not, it makes no difference. But I know what I saw, and my grandpa knew what he saw, and neither of us ever felt the need to convince anyone else of it. In fact, until today, I've never actually spoken of it to anyone other than my grandpa, and he passed away roughly 10 years ago. Thanks for taking the time to read this. Signed, Eric. And there you have it. 4 true reports of Bigfoot or Sasquatch encounters submitted by viewers. As always, I'd love to know what you think about these reports in the comment section down below, but please keep it respectful. I know that submitters often lurk in the comments looking for insight into their experience. And if you have an experience or an encounter that you'd like to share, just send it to the email in the description, and your story may just wind up in a future video. Anyways, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I'll be seeing you on down the road a ways. Biker out.